My experience with Scientology. Hi all, it's Em here. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Story 1. My experience with the Church of Scientology. This happened when I was around 17 years old and is still happening now. At 17, I felt lost in the world and stuck in a job I disliked, with work colleagues that didn't like me. This had to do with my accent, as I was quite well spoken, so they thought I was a rich kid. It all started on a Friday after work. The factory I worked in had a half day on Fridays, so I would just spend the rest of the day wandering around the city I lived in. It had been a tough day of relentless mocking, and I was reaching my breaking point. I went around the city looking for a new job. I visited the police recruitment center, the Army, Navy, and Air Force centers, and even the International Red Cross. I just wanted to get away from it all. After a few hours, I had a bag full of career pamphlets and still no idea what to do with my life. I turned the corner and immediately saw a sign sitting in front of me. I can remember it so vividly now. It said it was a free personality test. Are you curious about yourself? Come in. I then looked up at the building, and in a big fancy sign outside it, the Church of Scientology. Now, before I continue, yes, I already knew about Scientology. However, I had a morbid curiosity about it. I had heard all the horror stories and going-ons inside the church. But Tom Cruise was my favorite actor, and he seemed to have his life sorted out pretty good. My famous last words were written there. So I went inside. I was immediately greeted by a very nice lady. She asked me how I was doing and what she could do for me today. I asked if I could speak to somebody about the church and the personality test. She smiled and said I would be happy to. Please take a seat and I will get you someone to speak to. After a minute, I was introduced to an older man named Alan, and he was the head of my city's Scientology center. Alan took me to a small room to speak privately. When we entered, I immediately noticed the large picture of L. Ron Hubbard on the wall. We sat down and had a nice talk. I told him about how unhappy I was about where my life was going. I told him about how I wanted to leave, plus all the trouble I was having at work. He seemed genuinely concerned for me, and I felt like he wanted to help. After a while of talking, I agreed to do the personality test. He gave me the test and left the room, saying to give the test to the receptionist after I had finished. 2 hours later, I finished. Not joking. That's really how long it took. It was around 500 questions about anything and everything. I handed it to the receptionist, and she told me it would take some time to process. In the meantime, Alan had told her to take me to their private cinema and show me a film. I thought it was just going to be some old room in the back with a TV on the wall, but no. They did indeed have a private cinema. It could seat around 50 people and had a large screen in front. It did feel a bit weird just being by myself in a cinema owned by Scientology, but I bet that hasn't happened to many people. Or maybe it has. Anyway, I sat down and they played me the film. It was about 30 minutes long and consisted of a narrator explaining those strange feelings you sometimes get, with some mediocre acting following along. I remember a section about how much you doubt yourself, knowing you have locked a door, but going back to check multiple times. At one point, the film showed how a past event that happened to your mother while she was pregnant with you could affect your life in a negative way. Example, your mother was sick on a flight, so you are scared of flying. I also vaguely remember something about rotten eggs and how much an event involving them can hurt you. I know it sounds absurd, but in some ways, the film really made sense to me. When the film was done, I was taken to Alan's office and he told me my results. He told me I was extremely depressed, one of the most unmotivated people he had ever met, lacking cognitive thinking, and I was a waste of talent. Now, this made me very upset, but Alan said he could help me. He gave me about 4 books on DVD. He told me to read the books and watch the film before my course. I asked what course, and Alan told me he had signed me up to do a course at the center. He convinced me that if I didn't do this course, that my life would soon spiral out of control. He made me hand over quite a lot of money for the course and said I would receive an email about the course, which was in a month's time. I left the center, ran home, and immediately started reading the books I was given. This happened all over the weekend. I'd basically locked myself in my room and did nothing but read and reread those books and watch the DVD over and over again. Over the next week, I began taking notes about myself and my family. I emailed Alan with questions and concerns. I started resenting my mother for my life. I began to think that she was the problem, that everything bad that had happened to me was the result of her. I started to treat her badly, swearing at her, and did the best I could to ignore her. When I emailed Alan about my mother, he told me that if she was the catalyst for my problems, then maybe I should consider disconnecting from her. And I took that BS seriously. I made plans to totally leave her out of my life. A week before my course, I developed some kind of God complex towards everyone around me. What I read in those books told me what I could become. I saw everyone in my family as below me. I really became a truly spiteful person. Just days before my course, I was confronted by my mother and father. They said they were concerned about me and they searched my room. My dad took out all of my Scientology books and the DVD. I was outraged. I screamed and cursed at my parents. I said horrible, wicked things to them. I told them how I was going to leave them and how I never wanted to see them again. Hours of arguing back and forth, tears and crying. However, in the end, they did convince me that the church was a bad place. They said if I was so miserable at work, I should have told them. And that is true. To this day, I can't believe I didn't say anything to them. Instead, I went to Scientology. That night after the arguing had stopped, they sat me down and comforted me. I really couldn't believe it. After the way I treated them for the past 3 weeks, they still cared for me. The next day, I emailed Alan and told him I would not be coming back to the church. He quickly got back to me asking why, asking if it was my family, and if I was being forced not to go. However, I ignored him. The emails I received in the next few weeks were mad. He told me stuff like I should leave my family and I could stay at the church. He tried to convince me that it was all because of my mother. He even emailed me to say something along the lines of he won't be surprised if he read in the papers that I was found dead by suicide. I am very sure he crossed the line there, but I just kept ignoring him. The strangest one that I got was one in all binary code. 0011010111 this and 100010101110 that. I used a binary code translator, but it all came back as mixed up letters and numbers. None of it made sense. I eventually blocked him. However, it still hasn't stopped. About 2 or 3 times a year, I will get an email from the church. It's either asking how I am or asking about my family. When I get them, I immediately block the email address, but they just keep coming. It's always someone new saying they heard about my case and they were worried about me. The whole reason I'm writing this is because I just got one the other day, and I thought it would make a good warning. Please, I beg of you, do not go to a Church of Scientology center. If they can make me into a spiteful person in just a few hours, then what can they do with a person in a few months or a year? If anyone has any idea how to block an entire religious cult from my email, then please let me know. And if you're lost in life, sad or upset, then please talk to your family, friends, or doctors. When you are down, don't let others make you into a monster. Take it from me. After this event, I got help, and I am a happy, confident person now. Thank you so much for reading, and have a great day. Oh, and Alan, if you are reading this, you made me into a monster for your sake. Let's not meet again, Church in the Woods. I honestly hate anybody from any religion who tries to do this kind of behavior. It's one thing to invite someone to a service or meeting to try and help them, but it is completely different to take money from that person and alienate them from their friends and family. It is so interesting to me how we as a culture choose not to view Scientology as a cult, because so many famous people are in it, even though it has all of the telltale signs of being a straight-up cult. Story 2. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend, Joe, were outside all the time we could manage it. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning, and we'd stay in the woods all weekend, would only come out for school. We loved pretending we were frontiersmen. We'd build shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we walked the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we'd likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges no one went to. We fished. We hid from the trains. At night, we camped in woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. In fact, it was so fun we did it multiple times. Never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd see each other occasionally. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We'd do stuff with family in the day, and at night, We'd either catch drinks at a bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are hell of a mix. Soon, we decided to take a day. Walk the rails, camp one night, and walk home. The day came, we started out early in the morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot where we used to start right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we take the opposite direction just to be adventurous. We knew the land well. We had a map. So I said, what the hell? And off we went. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked and joined and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before night started to set in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had brought small hammocks to sleep on. But before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. Now, this is what we used to do in the old days, too. We'd walk the area around a little bit to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over a hill, and we were actually camping in their yard. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from on top of this short hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom. About 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet. No movement could be seen. No lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of the place, also weathered black. None of the windows had glass and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews and a built-up section in the front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no paths, no roads. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to our spot where we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods would elicit. Besides, at this point, it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep, and move on early in the morning. Night set in, and as we lay in our hammocks and shot the shit, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. Do you hear that? What the frick is that? It sounds like people singing. And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, starting to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree. But it was near pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't talk. When we got to the top, we saw it in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, can you believe this stuff? The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had about a football field length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared the crap out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language, because we couldn't understand a single word of it. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something, and then a bunch of voices would answer and sing. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and disturbing that I covered my ears. Then it stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, let's get the freak out of here, when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, They're coming out. We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out really well, but what we could see was a line of figures walking out the open doorway, all holding hands in a single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move toward us on the hill. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our crap, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down it. And we walked there. Got to a 24-hour gas station and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all just thought it was kids messing around. But I heard those voices and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that happened to me out in the woods. I don't know if these were Scientologists because I thought their whole thing was having these super nice mega churches that look really modern. Honestly, my guess is that OP and his friend just found a super religious and private group, maybe some Orthodox group, either that or they found a literal cult, which would explain the old shack and possible foreign language or tongues. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.